Greetings on this Maundy Thursday. I'm Pastor John Wertz. I'm one of the assistants to the bishop in the Virginia Synod. It's good to be with you as we gather for worship today. The Holy Gospel according to John, the 13th chapter. Now, before the festival of the Passover, Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart from this world and go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. The devil had already put into the heart of Judas, son of Simon Iscariot, to betray him. And during supper, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he had come from God and was going to God, got up from the table, took off his outer robe, and tied a towel around himself. Then he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel that was tied around him. He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, "Lord, are you going to wash my feet?" Jesus answered, "You do not know now what I am doing, but later you will understand." Peter said to him, "You will never wash my feet." Jesus answered, "Unless I wash you, you have no share with me." Simon Peter said to him, "Lord, not my feet only, but also my hands and my head." Jesus said to him, "One who is bathed does not need to wash except for the feet, but is entirely clean. And you are clean, though not all of you." For he knew who was to betray him. For this reason he said, "Not all of you are clean." After he had washed their feet, had put on his robe, and had returned to the table, he said to them, "Do you know what I have done to you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, for that is what I am. So if I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have set you an example that you should do as I have done to you. Very truly, I tell you, servants are not greater than their master, nor are messengers greater than the one who sent them. If you know these things, you are blessed if you do them." When he had gone out, Jesus said, "Now the Son of Man has been glorified, and God has been glorified in him. If God has been glorified in him, God will also glorify him in himself, and will glorify him at once. Little children, I am with you only a little longer. You will look for me. And as I said to the Jews, so now I say to you, where I am going, you cannot come. I give you a new commandment, that you love one another. Just as I have loved you, you also should love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another." The Gospel of the Lord. On this Maundy Thursday, as we gather around tables, as we gather in sanctuaries, as we gather on screens to remember the night in which Jesus was betrayed, and to remember his last meal with his disciples, you might find yourself wondering, hey, why isn't there bread and wine in this reading from the Gospel of John? After all, this is the night when Jesus commanded his disciples, commanded us to share in the bread and the wine, and to do this in remembrance of me. Well, interestingly enough, the Gospel of John doesn't include this part of the meal. Doesn't include what we now call the words of institution. Instead, the Gospel of John focuses on a different moment of that evening. The moment when Jesus got up from the table, took off his outer robe, tied a towel around his waist, and began to wash the feet of his disciples. The Gospel of John focuses on that moment when Jesus, the disciples' friend, their teacher, and their leader, began to undertake a job reserved for the lowliest of servants, washing the feet of those who followed him, washing the feet of those who had followed him out of fishing boats and across rough and dusty roads, those who'd followed him through far-flung towns and now into Jerusalem. To say the disciples were surprised is probably a bit of an understatement. Peter certainly wasn't comfortable with the idea. Lord, are you going to wash my feet? Was Peter's hesitant response when all this began. And in true Peter fashion, when it became clear that Jesus was going to wash his feet, Peter pushes back. Oh, you will never wash my feet. Peter, seemingly like so many of us, just wasn't comfortable with the idea of having his feet washed by someone else. Peter just wasn't comfortable with the idea of his teacher, his leader, his Lord, smelling and touching and cleaning his feet. Jesus, however, is clear. Unless I wash your feet, you have no share with me. Apparently, those words were enough to get Peter over his initial discomfort, because what we get in the text there is an instant transformation and transition from never, never, never to, hey, wait a minute, go ahead and just wash all of me. Again, Jesus is clear. What he's doing is not about getting dirt off the body. What Jesus is doing by washing the disciples' feet is undertaking this act for his followers, for his friends, to allow them to experience what I would call servant leadership. Jesus undertakes this act to help them to understand what it'll mean to follow in his footsteps. With this humble act of service, Jesus is setting an example of caring for his neighbor, setting an example of selfless love. And I think inviting us to make compassion and selfless love a hallmark of our own ministry. Now, interestingly, of the two things that Jesus told us to do on that evening when the disciples and Jesus gathered together prior to Jesus' arrest, foot washing didn't exactly catch on in the same way that communion did. I mean, I've never been to a church with weekly foot washing or a foot washing rail around the altar, right? But even though we don't wash each other's feet each time we gather for worship, that doesn't negate the lesson Jesus was teaching the disciples, teaching us, when he wrapped that towel around his waist, took the basin, and began to clean the disciples' dusty, smelly feet. For through this unexpected act, Jesus modeled an approach to leadership, modeled an approach to relationship that would become hallmarks of the Christian life. Humble, abundant love and generous, compassionate care for one another. On the night in which he was betrayed, Jesus took the time to show love, to demonstrate humility, to shower caring upon his friends. And I think Jesus invites us to follow his lead, to love one another as he loved us, to serve one another as he served God's people, to be generous with one another as he is generous with us. Now, realistically, for most people, that won't mean washing the feet of our friends Because the response many people have to feet is, well, ick, right? But even if we have trouble envisioning foot washing in our future, we can still serve and care for and love one another with the same generous, compassionate, selfless spirit that Jesus demonstrates that evening. The specifics of how we follow Jesus' example will vary, of course, depending on the circumstances of your life. For some, it will mean washing the hands and feet of a loved one who can no longer care for themselves. For some, it will mean taking the time to stop and talk to the person who is new in the community or who feels like they're on the outside looking in. For some, it will mean offering forgiveness and understanding in a moment of trial. For some, it will mean sacrificing a personal desire for the sake of lifting up a family member or friend. For some, it will mean being present in the darkness of grief and loss, or being patient in moments of growth and maturity. And for some, it will mean investing your time and your gifts in caring for those who lack proper resources. I can't tell you exactly what all this is going to look like for you. I can't tell you what it's going to look like to serve and to care for and to love one another with the same generous, compassionate, selfless spirit that Jesus demonstrates on that last evening with the disciples. But I'm convinced that as we are fed and nourished by the bread and wine of communion, as we are supported by the body of Christ, which surrounds us, and as we are inspired by Jesus' example and teaching, I'm convinced that you and I and all of God's people can do our best to follow Jesus' example and make humble service a hallmark of our lives. Sharing that love, sharing that generosity, sharing that compassion through our actions, through our words, so that the love of God may be clearly known in the world.